Alright, welcome to Web Shells, a brief tour by Bill Matthews. That's me. So we're going to look at what PHP web shells are. And I say PHP only because most of them are written in PHP. Most PHP servers, I guess, have this really bad reputation of being horribly insecure. So take like WordPress or Joomla or one of those. So the idea here is when you're attacking, you take the web shell code, you upload it via a, I guess, buffer overflow or maybe a file inclusion type of an attack. And the web server will lovingly just execute it, especially if you've set it up poorly, which we're going to cover in just a little bit. It's important to remember that web shells are artifacts of an attack. It's not really the attack itself. And that's in most cases. Sometimes, you could use a web shell to run an attack on something else, and we're going to take a look at some of that in the demo. A web shell gives an attacker access to your web server just like it was their own, so they can do whatever they want to. We're going to show a quick little pivot into another server. We'll also show, exporting Etsy password, just some silly things like that that really don't matter a whole lot, but it just shows the power of a web shell. So a web shell is basically gives the hacker access to your server, and more importantly, if you haven't segmented your servers properly, access to your entire internal network. So let's look at a couple of just mitigation type tips. You want to focus on least privilege. And what I mean by that is, your web server user, so if you're running Apache or you're running IIS or anything, those users really don't need to be admins on the server. They don't need to be root. They can be, low privilege. A lot of web servers, web software runs as what's called user nobody. It's called nobody for a reason. And that reason is because it has no user, it has no privilege. It can't do anything other than what the web server needs it to do. And that's really important, especially when it comes to buffer overflows, but also when it comes to just straight access. If it was a root user, it could do a lot more damage to that specific server than anything else. If you're running on a Windows machine, all bets are off at that point. So one you've heard tons and tons of times, patch some more. Information security people really love to tell you how to patch and patch all your systems. And you should, you absolutely should, but sometimes I understand you can't get to it, you can't do what you need to do and get all the patches done because you do want to test them. So in that case, I always recommend using a web app firewall or some sort of reverse proxy. That way, the server itself is not exposed to the internet and you can inspect the traffic in between. So bad guy comes to your website, he's talking to the web app firewall, the firewall is then talking to your server and displaying what that person's looking for, or more importantly, if it's an attacker, blocks that user. So you want to do those kinds of things. And then finally, pay attention to your pen tests and vulnerability management reports. These things will be on there. You're behind on your patches. Things aren't running with the lowest level privilege. You're not using a web app firewall. And sometimes, if the pen tester is exceptionally clever, they'll say, hey, you're already running web shells on these servers, and that's bad. So if you read the blog post that accompanies this video, you'll see I sort of came to this because of the Equifax thing. Basically what was happening is someone had compromised their servers, planted some web shells, and then began selling access to the web shells. At least that's the current rumor on the street. So let's look at a couple detection points. So you want to log and inspect all the traffic, inbound, outbound, everything that's coming into your web server. And you'll see a lot of nonsense that's going on, and you can sort of tune that down to just the stuff you're not really expecting. So in our particular case, our web server is going to make a connection to a MongoDB server, which is kind of like a SQL server, except no SQL. And we're not really expecting that. We don't expect our web server to be able to do that. So when it does that, it should throw an alarm. It won't in our case because we have a very simple lab setup, but in your environments, that's not expected behavior. That should throw some sort of an alarm. You want to watch for new and unexpected files. This is important. If you're a web developer, you pretty much know what files should be on the server. And if you're inside of, if you're outside of a change window, really they shouldn't change a whole lot. So you want to watch for things. So in our case, we're going to plant agent.php. Well, that's not really code that should be on my server. So I should be able to detect that and say, hey, agent.php showed up, something's going on. You want to limit permissions, and I include this in detection, even though it's technically a mitigation point. But I include it here because when you do limit the permissions and you get everything narrowed down, you can really focus in on what's supposed to be happening as opposed to a lot of noise. I like to also monitor SQL queries in my applications, and that's really important to me because when I first got into this, SQL injection was a huge thing. And this was a good way to watch for it and see what was going on before there were a lot of protections for it. So you can kind of see, and again, that can go with anything. It doesn't have to be SQL queries. It could also be, you know, watching Mongo queries or watching, you know, network traffic for bad stuff. So just monitoring things that are going on. And then finally, watch outbound traffic on your web server. The bad guy could be calling home to get more instructions. The shell could just be saying, hey, I'm here, I'm awake. And you're not really expecting that sort of traffic. So you should be able to alert on it. You should be able to deal with it. So now, everyone's favorite time, a demo. So we have a little network here set up. We've got our little victim server over here in the corner. And we have our, well, my video's not running. So we have our victim server here. This is called web shells, just because that's what I called it. Then we have our unsuspecting victim. That's the server we're going to pivot to. That's running our MongoDB instance. And then we have our attack box. I affectionately call him Breaky. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use what's called Weavely. It's a web shell that's out there. You can see it in the reference. And we call out to our agent.php that's running on web shells over there. Now, what it's doing is it's passing that password in because that's what I set when I set it up. So now you can see .133 is where agent.php is running. And I'm over here on Breaky. So now I've connected. I'm now on web shells. I'm in the var www HTML directory. Blah, say that 3 times real fast. So then I see agent.php. I can see index.html. It's just the default Apache setup with PHP. When I come over here, I see the same things. So now, what I really want to be able to do is I want to be able to go from that server to another server. So over here is .134, which is running Mongo on port 27017, as you can see. So when I hit this NetScan instance, eventually it will pop up, boom. So now I have a successful pivot. I've talked to a server that isn't the server I attacked, so the code's not running on it, it's not living there, it's not doing anything really. So I've pivoted away. I've talked to another server that has nothing to do with the server that I've actually compromised, that I'm actually running the web shell on. But if I go back to that server, I can cat etc password. It's not the same etc password that's on Breaky. I could pretty much do anything at this point. I don't have to really mess around with too much of anything. So you can see where segmentation and limited privileges really comes into play. So that's it for this little brief tour of web shells. Hope you enjoyed it. And as always, keep in touch.